everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Interlink podcast, an initiative under the Center for New Economic Studies at OP Jindal Global University. Interlinked aims to hold nuanced conversations on the interdisciplinary nature of problems plaguing the world today. As we hold conversations on the socio political climate, we want to break down these intellectual barriers and look at topics in a way that allow us to question them from several facets. If you're listening to us for the first time, please do have a look at our previous works as well. On today's episode, we have Miss Suhani Sharma, a law student at Jindal Global Law School and one of the team leads of Swabhiman, a student led initiative under the Center for New Economic Studies. Suhani has an undergraduate degree in political science and economics from Lady Shri Ram College for Women, and she is particularly interested in building legal interventions that emerge from deep academic engagement. Swabhiman, which quite literally means self respect, explores the intersection of gender with development, social policy, and entrepreneurship. Through the stories of women and LGBTQ individuals who are challenging stereotypes and creating impact in both organized and unorganized sectors, the project highlights voices that are too often left out of the mainstream. Our discussion today centers on an eye opening report titled Mapping Queer and Trans Safety, Caste Belonging, and Collective Care in Private Universities, which is soon to be published by Swabhiman. This study takes a hard look at four private universities in Delhi NCR and asks a question that cannot be ignored. When these institutions boast about being inclusive, what does that actually mean for queer, trans, and caste oppressed students navigating life on campus? Welcome to the podcast, Sohani. How are you holding up?
Hi, Medha. Thank you so much for that introduction. I would like to say that working on this research report has truly been a challenging yet very, very rewarding experience for me personally and for the team because essentially it was a student-led research approach. Um, yeah, so holding up quite excited in a very excited way, talking to you. Looking forward to that.
That's amazing. So, before we begin, I'd like to ask you to tell us a little more about this report and why this topic is important for the audience.
Um, Very briefly, to put it, our goal was to critically examine what inclusion actually looks like in private university spaces beyond the glossy brochures and policy documents that we're handed. Um, we focused on four private universities in Delhi NCR region, as you just mentioned, and combined those survey responses with faculty interviews. The study looked at three key dimensions essentially. First, how queer and trans students, especially those from caste oppressed and marginalized backgrounds, experience safety on campus. Second, whether institutional grievance mechanisms are accessible and trusted. And third, how students themselves imagine care and solidarity and even accountability for that matter, because these aspects become extremely critical points of discussion when we are in the policy spaces, right? So, education often is framed as a ladder for social mobility and equity, but our study also tries to show that these ladders themselves can become walls. And something that would I would also like to flag during the initial bit of our conversation itself is that this report is not just a critique. It is also an invitation to rethink how safety and inclusion can genuinely be practiced and not just promised as it is extremely important for the higher education, administration, management, even the peers, the people who are actually there um, to think what safety can look like, what inclusivity actually means to be in the higher education spaces.
I agree. And I think both of us are students as well. So it even more makes sense for us to start from the ground level. And I think to move forward with the concept of inclusion, in your report, you show that even queer collectives, which are often imagined as a safe haven for many students, can produce caste hierarchies in themselves. So, how does the presence of caste hegemony within queer spaces complicate the very idea of inclusion that these groups claim to embody?
Yeah, so as you just mentioned, that why this topic is also important for the audience, I would like to relate it to this question to that itself, because safety on campus is not a niche issue, right? It determines who can access education, who can flourish it, and in that ways, the queer collectives are often imagined as these safe havens. But when caste hierarchies are reproduced within them, the idea of inclusion is deeply compromised, as you just mentioned, right? So, what this shows us is that inclusion cannot be understood only in terms of gender or sexuality. The caste fundamentally structures the social life in India, and ignoring it means exclusion is carried into spaces that claim to resist it from the point one, right? Um, in practice, the Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi queer students often find their voices being sidelined even within these collectives because Savarna norms dominate. And this is me not saying from a person who is had a research on this, but also a person who had to go through those anecdotal accounts and be more knowledgeable of the fact that generally is sidelining a feature that we don't see very simply in these spaces, right? It's very deep rooted. So inclusion becomes superficial if it does not address caste is essentially, which is very important to also notice when we become a part of these collectives or part of certain societies that work in these segments of inclusivity and safe spaces.
Yeah, I think that's a concept that and a condition that even non queer collectives should focus on, because when it comes to decision making, most of it is dominated by upper castes, even if it is in a non queer collective. And I think giving people the chance to make decisions has a sort of power that needs to be given to those who actually require it. And building on that, uh, my next question is, when queer collectives replicate caste hierarchies like we just talked about, how can we hold them accountable in a way that challenges that exclusion but without reinforcing the institution's narrative that marginalized groups are simply divided?
Um, I would say, Mehta, that's a very delicate process and a very delicate exercise to have or even speak about. We must name caste exclusion within these queer collectives, but also resist the institutional narrative that marginalized groups are essentially too divided in that way. The way forward is to emphasize that these exclusions are not failures of solidarity, but symptoms of a broader structural inequality that exists. Accountability then should be directed at dismantling these hierarchies, not at blaming the marginalized groups for those fragmentation to begin with. I think that would be my key understanding of how there could be an exercise uh, that can happen with like peers, with certain collectives, as you said, even the non-queer collectives, and the administration and the institution. So that would be my very brief understanding of this delicate dance that can happen between these bodies. Yeah.
Absolutely. And when we talk about non queer collectives, or in fact, the concept of non queerness, we also encounter with allies. And your report mentions the precarious nature of being an ally, but crossing the boundary where the like you said, the delicate dance, I would like to use that, between knowing where to stand up for someone and knowing where to step back and give the people the power they want. So, my question to you would be that In your view, what really distinguishes performative allyship from genuine coalition building in campus context?
Um, that takes a lot of the research actually, and it was one of the most interesting bit to read on, to write on, to even discuss with the team, with the faculty, because we were going back and forth with the surveys that the survey responses that we collected, and this particular bit on allyship, because um, as I said, that it's very delicate, even the exercise of putting what is considerable, what is too much, what is less, right? So, a performative allyship is often about gestures like attending events, using the correct language, being politically correct, posting solidarity on social media, but it stops short of shifting power. And I would pick up from your own understanding of it that power is too essential in this aspect, right? It is. It is also like the allyship is also characterized by recentering of Savarna or privileged voices. The genuine coalition building, by contrast, begins with listening, with accountability, and with giving up as simple as symbolic and material power. So it is very slow and often very uncomfortable work, I would say, because it means redistributing the resources, the leadership, and the space. So, in the elite campus context, the difference essentially lies in whether the allies are willing to move past the performance towards the practice. And that is something that, as I said, took a lot bit of our research that, okay, what is performance? What is actually practice? What can you categorize as a practice? Because even with when we talk about protests, there's a lot of discussion on armchair activism, right? So there's certain narratives that you need to fill gaps in when you talk about the performative allyship and the genuine coalition building. In my approach, it would be very briefly put that there has to be something beyond that performance and something that can essentially bring in that shift in the material power, and then only you can establish that okay, there's some aspect of practice associated with it and not just performance. So yeah, it is tough, but I think there can be certain understanding with certain features when you look closely at it, and that is something that is essentially important with a sensitive research study like this, and even in general environments. The basic understanding is to be intersectional in your awareness, very sensitive in your awareness. So I think with that, uh, you can understand that where is the performance and where is the practice.
Do you think universities are making enough efforts to bring our focus on intersectionality, whether through courses, whether through workshops or not? Because I learned about the concept of intersectionality when I came to university. Before that, my brain could not even comprehend the idea of how caste, gender, sexuality together form the experience that you live through. So, do you think universities are doing a good job of of bringing awareness to this concept?
So I've had a stint of being a student in both public and private university, right? So what I essentially feel is when I was right out of school in my undergrad, the very first class that I had, I still remember the professor talking about intersectional approach in understanding politics. And I was like, these are too many words that I do not understand beyond the understanding of the politics itself. Because I remember I had this Andrew Haywood book, like a very thick course book, and it just talked about politics. So I was like, what is the understanding of intersectional here? And over like time since I was a first year college student in my undergrad till now, I think essentially intersectional awareness is all about not seeing things in silos, and more importantly the social structures. When you look at them, you should not cull out of like certain aspects and look at it in silos. And answering to your question that if the universities or institutions doing their best for this, I would just say that um, I mean, there have been considerable efforts, is what I've felt, in both public and the private spaces of education, but still, I feel it's not enough because why I say this is also from my own personal experiences because certain times they're absolutely amazing electives that we are being offered, even the core courses that we are being offered, but this aspect becomes buried under a social research aspect, like only if you're interested in social sciences that much or the social sector that much, then only you need to know about a sensitive research or an intersectional awareness. If not, then you're just okay with your own understanding of like corporate and your own even like it's very new now that people are starting to reflect on environmental causes. I feel that's little bit of a stretch because environment was always there. Global warming was always there. It's just because ESG has become in traction, people are starting to relate it with the corporate law. And then, I mean, this is me saying from my own personal experience, but I feel that these aspects like intersectionality, sensitive research, or even inclusivity, safety on campus, these things have become buried under aspects of if you're really interested in the social sciences, right? And not many things are picked up by, I would say, the institutions to really promote it or bring it into a more general understanding in the general awareness of the student body. So, yeah, I mean, that's my little takeaway on that.
I think I would agree with you on that because even if there is a stereotype put on this concept, it genuinely should be approached right from, I think, middle school in any little way as possible so that the idea of sensitizing people on such crucial and sensitive matters starts early on. And that is the age when you start forming your own ideas, you start thinking about the world in a different way, you start understanding the world. And if these ideas, these concepts are introduced from that age, it makes a lot of difference. I think going back to the allyship point, in your view, is it possible for allies to give up space in elite universities without fundamentally redistributing privilege outside campus walls? Because even if allies give up space on campus, their structural privilege doesn't disappear. So, is the giving up of space inside the university a real act of justice, or does it risk becoming symbolic because the wider system outside still reproduces inequality? What do you think?
That is quite a loaded question. I would say that within a university, giving up leadership positions or speaking opportunities can be meaningful. But unless privilege outside the university, it could be family wealth, it could be networks, it could be as simple as fluency, the global exposure. Until and unless those aspects are also addressed, then giving up space risks becoming symbolic, right? The real justice cannot be confined to the campus boundaries only. It requires structural redistribution beyond them. Um, and in that aspect, I do feel that giving up space is also something that becomes essentially double folded in that way because just your giving up space in the university is as I said not intersectionally aware as much as one is supposed to be in that matter. So yeah.
But I think a counter argument to this point would be what can we do about it? Because a lot of privileged people didn't ask to be privileged, they were born in privilege, right? So, what are there any ways that you can suggest people to be more mindful about the way that they think about campus collectives when they enter a university or a public space, in fact, how can they be more mindful of their privilege and uh, think about what their privilege could how it could make a change for somebody else who is not from the same walk of life?
That is true. That's why I began answering with the fact that it is quite a loaded question. And I mean, just to just to respond to that counter argument, I would say that reflecting back to the report, I would just want to say that when queer and caste oppressed students feel unsafe, excluded, or unsupported, their educational opportunities shrink, right? Their mental health is affected, and their capacity to belong in academia is compromised. For our audience and for those um, probably who think that this is like having coming from a privileged background is not something that can be put on them particularly, right? Which can include students, educators, administrators, everyone. The importance lies in recognizing that safety is not just about absence of violence. Like that is the fundamental understanding that anybody can have, privileged or not privileged. That safety cannot be as linear as just the absence of violence, but also the presence of care, the presence of representation, and genuine accessibility. So, if you're working towards these aspects, then I think you being privileged or not privileged will not come into that much of a discussion. Also, this will take us back and forth to the concept of allyship again, but I feel these are the very fundamental truths that you can always go back to when you think that, okay, I was not, okay, I was chosen, but I was not the person who was like, okay, I need to be privileged or something like that. So I think this is again an uncomfortable work also. Um, uh, but I mean, in the end, there's certain fundamental truths that lie also. So just being cognizant of those facts is enough for you to also realize where you are on the social structure and the social mobility aspect, and what you can do for others to be included as well, and what safety means, what inclusivity means. So I think in that aspect, there could be work done from both privileged, underprivileged, not privileged. I mean, yeah.
Right. So when you talk about safety, we might think of when we try to tangibilize safety, I think when it comes to university, we might think of anti-discrimination policies because that is a safety net that is provided not only in campus policies but also in the constitution. And a key argument that the report makes is that formal policies like anti discrimination clauses or grievance systems cannot be separated from campus culture because one reinforces the other. Could you share an example where a seemingly progressive policy on paper actually failed in practice because the surrounding culture made it unusable?
Yeah, this was very much eye-opening for me as well, and I look forward for the audience to reading our report soon. A very clear example was gender-neutral washrooms. On paper, several universities have them, but in reality, students often find these spaces locked, hidden, or even stigmatized for that matter. So while the policy does exist, the culture makes it unusable, right? And another example that I can think of is the grievance committees. While they are mandated, students widely distrust them. There have been a lot of anecdotal accounts where they're fearing retaliation or even futility. So, so there have been accounts that refer to it in a way that makes us realize that these spaces, rather than working towards the objectives that they seek to achieve, they're rather reinforcing the discrimination aspect of it. And here too, the policy framework is progressive, but the surrounding culture makes it inaccessible. Like when we talk about these universities, um, the the policy is there, and when you read it, you will feel like this is an amazing piece of work written, and it would just be and it be so good to have be in a space that promotes this kind of policy. But when you come to the aspect of real promotion and the reality of it, I would say it's very different. And for me, it was personally shocking because there were so many accounts, as I said, which just it just showed that there's no confidence in those institutions that actually frame those policies so well. So yeah, I in that way, I think these policies do fall short in practice due to the campus culture as well. Yeah.
You mentioned that a lot of students, respondents in your survey, did not have any trust in the grievance redressal systems and committees. Why do you think that was?
I think it was more based uh, on the fear, as I said, of retaliation, the fear of being excluded, the fear um um, of being approached in a way that they would not feel comfortable in, or probably being left unheard. Um, I mean, why I say that it was a sensitive report is also because there were anecdotal accounts, and people would actually write what made them scared of approaching these um, institutional, I would say, I would I would not want to sound sound like a critic, but institutional bulwarks in some manner. So, uh, I mean, the major aspects was the campus culture that was holding them back, and also their fear of not being heard. Also, is what I felt was one of the major reasons of them being ambivalent. Also, because there were certain responses in which actively respondents mentioned not sure, which I feel is a very is was a very ambivalent culture uh, uh, to see because um I mean, yeah, it just navigates us back to how safe the person feels on campus, right? And there's a lot of discussion about it, but still, if the person is not ready or not willing to go to these institutions and seek help or even flag the issue, then I think that's a very foundational understanding of from where you need to start, right? So yeah, I that was a very, very eye-opening understanding for me as well. Because to me, at the face of it, I thought the policies must be in work, but there's must be certain gaps as well. Like as a researcher, also you do bring certain aspect of your own understanding to the research that you're working on. But to me, after going through the survey responses, I could feel like, oh my God, that it could be futile to even approach these spaces in the first place to for the redressal of your and redressal in itself is a very loaded concept. So the grievance committees, they sometimes make it sound as a problem to belong from certain identity. And yeah, there's a multifold discussion regarding this, but this is my very brief uh, take on how these ambivalence and fear could probably withhold them from approaching these committees.
I think it also takes us back to the idea that I am, when I was going through the report, I also just remembered that I saw that the members of the committee, of the grievance redressal committees, were often of the upper caste or of the mainstream sexuality and mainstream, mostly men, I'm pretty sure. And I think that also plays a huge role in the way a person feels about approaching such a committee. And that takes us back to the idea of giving up power. And I think this is a great example to say that one way you can give up power is to include people from marginalized communities into such committees, so that change can start from somewhere, and this is a great place for a change to start from. Moving forward, my next question is that many respondents in the report, when I read it, simply said not sure when asked about certain existence of certain institutional policies. Do you see that lack of certainty as a failure of communication by the institution, or as a survival strategy by students navigating precarity and fear?
Um, this is very much associated with the previous conversation we just had. So I would say that this ambivalence takes shelter under both, right? Because institutions often fail to communicate these policies that we've been talking about transparently. But students also learn to navigate precarity by expressing uncertainty. I mean, to simply put, saying not sure avoids the risk of naming or critiquing the institutions too openly, because as I mentioned, there's always a fear of retaliation. Even while undertaking this research, there were certain um, I would say there were certain setbacks for us personally as a team, because it the reputation of universities also comes into play, right? So, responding to this particular question, I think we interpreted not sure not just as ignorance, but as a strategic choice in environments where certainty can possibly invite harm. And yeah, so basically, it was not always very easy for the respondents to possibly, it's not a very simple choice of making a tick somewhere. So not sure was something that also we respected, and we understood where the respondent might be coming from. So that was our interpretation of this kind of ambivalence that we saw in the survey responses.
Building to that, what was very interesting to me was that this research was conducted within institutions that made themselves be very hostile to critique. So, how did your own positionality as a researcher affect that? Did you face any resistance? Like you already mentioned that you did face resistance. What was the resistance? What form, what nature did that pushbacks come in?
Um, Firstly, I'll take over on researchers' positionality, because our positionalities, our caste locations, our gender, sexuality inevitably shaped the research encounter. Some students may have felt fear, others more cautious. We tried to minimize the hierarchies with the survey by making the data anonymous, ensuring that there was no tracking per se, and centering the students' own words and anecdotal accounts rather than our own interpretations coming to play here and there. So, still, it is very important for us to acknowledge that no researcher is a neutral observer. Our presence mediated what um, we shared. And uh, about the pushback or kind of resistance, I think there were certain subtle, not overt, but definitely certain subtle pushbacks. Some faculty or administrators were uneasy about a project that might expose the uncomfortable truths of private institutions. There was hesitancy around associating the institutional names with research that could reflect poorly on reputations. At times, students themselves expressed the fatigue in this kind of a research, a reluctance to share experiences in spaces where they weren't even very sure that any change can happen. So the resistance was not always very hostile, but in terms of silence, there was present the hesitation and even institutional defensiveness. There's a defensiveness that comes into play at the face of certain research. Um, so, in terms of reluctance, I think it also kind of inspired us more to work on it, because we were determined to find uh, to really determine to find what actually safety can mean. And that was as simple as I can put it. For an elaborate research like this, our main goal was to see what safety really means for different students on campus. So, yes, there were many reluctances, many hesitances, many kind of pushbacks. But still, I think for a research study to happen and that too as sensitive as this, one has to overcome and one has to keep working towards that, is what I felt.
I think that's a great lesson to take away from this podcast, if not anything else. Uh, Again, as you mentioned, universities, especially private universities, are very protective of their reputations. But if universities fear reputational damage, do you think that fear itself can be leveraged by students, by the student body, to demand change?
Yeah, that's very interesting because I was just talking to one of the team members yesterday. And as I said, all these pushbacks really made us more motivated to carry on with the research study with whatever little resource we had. And yes, universities are highly protective of their brands. Students can and do use this to push for the reforms by highlighting exclusions in ways that threaten that very reputation. However, this leverage must be used cautiously, is what I feel, because universities might respond by improving those optics, right, rather than making substantive change. Um, the challenge is to push for reforms that go deeper than the surface level image management. So yes, these this fear of reputational fear can definitely be used, as I said, in a very cautious manner. Then that can yield really good results, is what I feel.
Absolutely. And as we near the end of this podcast, uh, my question is, what is the next step for you and also for those who want to build on this work? Is there any way our listeners can engage with it or contribute to this area of research?
Um, Firstly, on the next steps, as a team, as a very small team, we are very excited, inspired, and happy that we could present certain credible work that took us long, that made us realize a lot of things, made us understand a lot of things, learn a lot of things, and even unlearn a lot of things for that matter. So the immediate steps that we have in hand is to take the findings back into the very spaces they speak about, to the student collectives, to administrators, to faculty allies, and then use them as a springboard for dialogue. Having this podcast is obviously one of the very first preliminary jab at it. Beyond that, we hope that this report becomes a resource for activists and policymakers who want to push for more accountable grievance systems, for caste sensitive counseling, for peer led mechanisms of care. Um, for those who want to build on this work and the kind of work that can be associated with it, the next step is really to deepen it, to widen the scope that it entails, and to translate research into a real structural change, is what I feel. Because these words are multifaceted, these words, but become hollow if you just see them as big words. You know, even a small step towards structural change can lead to a big result, is what I feel. Because at the face of it, it might feel um, that you're very little in this entire world, like just a speck of star. Like, what can you actually do? So, for that, I think reading, of understanding, even having a basic awareness about things that are happening on campus, in your in your realities outside of campus, that will make a lot of difference. And about the listeners and a bit of takeaway, I really hope that this conversation could make you think about something, because that's the essential objective, to actually think of these things around you. You don't necessarily have to sit and work. You don't necessarily have to start researching on it. It's just about you being aware of the presence of these issues around you is enough. And listeners can start by asking sharper questions of their own institutions, that do students really feel safe here? Do grievance systems actually work? Uh, do we account for caste when we talk about queerness? Um, Engagement also means supporting collectives 100%, amplifying the marginalized voices, and refusing to settle for those token gestures that we aim to speak about in the research report. And I hope I did speak about it, even if briefly, during our conversation today. And if there's one takeaway, it is that safety is not guaranteed by a policy document, it is created or denied by our everyday campus culture. So, our preliminary objective as a student should be to make that campus culture something that you would want your coming um, cohorts or peers or juniors to, I mean, look up to. And you will, I think it's a very proud moment for you too, as a senior, as a peer, even as a junior, to feel that there would be certain substantial changes can happen in your own college, and people will feel safe and included. So yeah, that's very briefly put a takeaway that I would like to have for our listeners today.
That brings us to an amazing end to this wonderful podcast. I am so glad and I thank you so much for joining us today. Um,
Thank you so
I
much, Medya, for having me. It was a likewise very good experience for me to actually talk about the research report, and I hope everybody who's listening to us also had a good time listening.
I'm very excited for the report to get published, and I hope everyone who's listening to this podcast gets to read that report and also experience it and get the revelations that I did when I was reading this report. I think that's a great start to a very meaningful change that can happen throughout this country and even global, I hope. So, thank you so much for joining today, and thank you so much for listening to us. Please make sure that you also listen to our other podcasts. Good night and take care.